June 21st was National Indigenous Day. This year, much of the focus has been on residential schools. I want us to take a moment to remember the victims who have been found in unmarked graves in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and BC, as well as those whose graves have not been discovered. While it is incredibly important that we as Canadians acknowledge the hurts of the past, one of the ways of working towards reconciliation is to learn more about Indigenous cultures in Canada. Indigenous peoples are more than victims. They are members of many groups who had complex and beautiful cultures before Europeans came to North America. June is National Indigenous History Month, and as well as learning about trauma experienced by Indigenous people, it is also important to learn about their cultures. For many years, Indigenous people were not allowed to take part in their traditions, such as smudging, powwows, and sacred fires. Now these communities are trying to relearn their traditions and share them with their youth. The things that were taken away from them are important. Indigenous Presbyterians at churches like Place of Hope in Winnipeg are relearning and using many of these traditions in their worship. The Reverend Margaret Mullen is both a Presbyterian minister and an Indigenous elder. She is working to include both Christian and Indigenous traditions in her ministry. When we were in Winnipeg, she taught us about some of the important teachings, traditions, and practices. This included learning about smudging. At Place of Hope, smudging is used in preparation for the service as a way of cleansing and purifying. It allows individuals to cast away their negative thoughts and prepare their hearts for worship. Many individuals also pray during smudging. For the members of Place of Hope, learning and participating in their traditional cultural practices such as smudging is just as meaningful as confession and communion. One of the other things that was interesting at Place of Hope was how Indigenous art was combined with Christian imagery. Sometimes we forget that many of the parts of our church service and images in our sanctuary are actually cultural, not religious. The presence of Scottish and Canadian flags and use of blue in Presbyterian churches are examples, but so are many other things that we take for granted, such as pews and sitting in them, candles, the shape and style of our communion ware, and even our instruments. Where we might think of an organ as a religious instrument, Indigenous churches might use a drum. Where we might light a candle to remind us of God's presence, Indigenous Christians might use a smudge. Where we might sit in rows, Indigenous Christians might form a circle. It is important that we learn to separate what is culture from what is Christian, and accept that non-European traditions are equally valuable. The way that Margaret and the other people in Winnipeg are combining these two cultures and traditions is beautiful. As we come to the end of Indigenous History Month, I encourage you to take some time to learn about the traditions of our Indigenous brothers and sisters. The goal of residential schools was to erase Indigenous culture. Learning about Indigenous culture is a small way we can each help to right those wrongs. As I was looking back on what I learned from my time out west, I was reminded of the message that Margaret left our group with when we were in Winnipeg. Be determined to make a change rather than angry or heartbroken about what has happened. As we continue to learn the truth about the awful toll of residential schools, let us be determined to help heal the wounds that have been caused.